she gets put together through this DNA slicing machine, and she's naked, but like, she can't be naked throughout the movie, so like, what do we do? And, you know, and that's where the bandage idea came from.
The Fifth Element wasn't just another sci-fi flick. It was madness stitched in neon, couture, and chaos. Born from the mind of a French teenager, it grew into a billion-color world of flying taxis, exploding opera halls, and a villain who never even faces the hero. Behind the spectacle lurked stranger truths. A 400-page epic cut to ribbons, a flamboyant role once written for royalty, and a love language whispered only off-screen. From weapons that really worked to costumes that nearly broke their wearers, these are the weirdest verified secrets behind Luc Besson's cult classic, A Universe at 16. Luc Besson's obsession with the Fifth Element didn't begin in a studio office or on a movie set. It began in the quiet corners of his teenage years. He wasn't surrounded by Hollywood lights, mentors, or film schools. He was a 16-year-old in France with little more than blank paper, a pen, and a mind that refused to sit still. Where most teenagers filled notebooks with doodles, lyrics, or diary entries, Besson filled his with alien races, cosmic battles, and a strange orange-haired hero who would one day be known as Leelu. This wasn't a casual imagination, it was survival. Growing up in a small village, Besson felt isolated, and his escape route wasn't sports or social life, it was storytelling. He created Zorg long before Gary Oldman snarled through plastic and southern drawls. He sketched towering Mondoshaans, divine protectors weighed down by giant suits of armor. He began designing universes not as blueprints for a future film, but as an entire world he could live inside when reality seemed too narrow. For Besson, The Fifth Element wasn't a project. It was a parallel life. But as that life expanded, so did the story. What began as a teenager's secret mythology quickly grew into something massive. By his 20s, Besson had produced a draft that was less a screenplay and more a galactic encyclopedia, over 400 pages long. It was a trilogy in everything but name, a saga that spanned multiple planets, dozens of alien cultures, intricate political systems, and whole religions invented to explain why one artifact or species mattered. There were footnotes for histories, invented languages with grammar rules, and backstories for minor characters who would never even get dialogue on screen. He was building a cathedral of fiction, but there was a problem. Cathedrals don't fit into theaters. No studio would bankroll something so sprawling, especially from a French director without blockbuster credentials. The scope was too risky, too expensive, too weird. In a move that nearly broke him, Besson began cutting. Civilizations vanished. Subplots were erased. The trilogy collapsed into a single movie. He was forced to distill decades of dreaming into 2 hours of spectacle. The Fifth Element wasn't born out of freedom. It was carved down by necessity, and that compression left scars. When you watch the film today, you can feel the missing pages, the hints of stories hiding off screen, the way a background extra in elaborate costume looks like they walked out of a saga we'll never get to read. The sudden jumps in tone, the unexplained alien technology, the rituals that appear fully formed and disappear just as quickly. These weren't accidents. They were remnants of a larger mythology, fragments of Besson's teenage galaxy smuggled into a compressed frame. Critics at the time called the movie messy. They said it felt chaotic, like it was trying to be too many things at once. But that chaos is exactly why the film feels alive. It isn't a clean corporate sci-fi formula. It's the product of a teenager's imagination colliding with adult limitations. A slice of something far bigger, a window into a universe that had been brewing for decades. That's why the world of The Fifth Element feels both overstuffed and underexplained. Because it is. It's the visible tip of a story iceberg with entire continents left submerged. In that sense, The Fifth Element is less about what's on screen and more about what's missing. Every flying taxi zipping through the smoggy city hints at roads we'll never travel. Every alien religion shown in a single shot suggests scriptures we'll never read. Every costume designed for a background extra whispers of societies Besson had mapped out years earlier. The richness comes not from what the film explains, but from what it implies. And that comes directly from the fact that the universe was imagined not in a boardroom, but by a teenager dreaming without limits. That teenager's imagination would one day collide with producers, actors, and fashion houses. But before it reached the screen, it existed in a place too big for film reels. And maybe that's why it still resonates. Because behind the explosions, the opera, and the neon chaos, you can still see the boy who wrote his way out of loneliness by building a galaxy no one asked for, but everyone remembers. And if the story began too big, some roles were nearly too big for their actors, especially the one written for a different kind of star. Ruby Rhod, written for royalty. Ruby Rhod isn't just a character. He's a firework that detonates in the middle of the Fifth Element and refuses to stop sparkling. Leopard print, high-pitched shrieks, live broadcast chaos. He's the loudest thing in a film already crammed with flying cars and neon explosions. But here's the twist. Ruby wasn't meant for Chris Tucker at all. He was meant for royalty. Musical royalty. Luc Besson's first vision for Ruby Rhod was Prince, and in hindsight, it makes perfect sense. In the 1990s, Prince wasn't just a musician, he was a walking revolution. He blurred gender, style, and genre with a confidence no one else could match. Ruby's flamboyant swagger, his shrieking dominance of every scene, his ability to turn a stage into a planet, all of it fit Prince's onstage persona like a glove. Besson imagined the future with Prince at the center, a performance so outrageous that it would bend the film's gravity around him. A meeting even happened. Prince looked over the script, saw the potential, and for a moment, it seemed like destiny. But then came the wardrobe. Jean-Paul Gaultier, the fashion legend tasked with designing over 1,000 costumes for the film, had already imagined Ruby as a walking spectacle. Lace, mesh, plunging necklines, animal print that screamed louder than a sound system. It wasn't subtle. It was an earthquake of fabric and glitter. And that was the problem. For all his daring, Prince thought the designs leaned too far into parody. Too feminine, he reportedly said. Too extreme, even for him. This from the man who once performed in assless pants. For reasons never fully explained, Prince backed out. The flamboyant anchor of Besson's neon opera suddenly vanished, leaving one of the strangest vacancies in sci-fi casting history. Enter Chris Tucker. At the time, he was an up-and-coming comedian, fresh from roles in Friday and Money Talks. Younger, faster, and more chaotic than Prince, Tucker didn't bring the same sultry danger, but he brought speed. Ruby Rhod with Prince would have been a velvet storm. Ruby Rhod with Tucker became a high-speed lightning strike, spitting words so fast audiences barely had time to breathe. But it wasn't easy. Gaultier's costumes didn't get any lighter just because the role changed hands. In fact, they were torture. One outfit alone weighed nearly 50 pounds, with a rigid spine that made sitting impossible. On set, Tucker couldn't lean back in a chair, couldn't slump between takes, couldn't even exhale fully without the fabric pushing back. His only relief was standing against a wall like a mannequin waiting to be plugged in. And yet, on screen, he looks untouchable, bouncing, shrieking, gyrating like the galaxy's most unhinged MC. That's the strange brilliance of Ruby Rhod. He's not just a character, he's a collage. You can feel Prince's ghost in the DNA, the original intent for someone who embodied pop royalty. You can hear Tucker's comedic cadence, ratcheted up to cartoon speed, and you can see Gaultier's fingerprints, fashion functioning less like clothing and more like armor. Ruby doesn't just wear costumes, he survives them. Together, those three influences collide into something so bizarre it shouldn't work, but somehow does. In fact, Ruby Rhod became one of the most divisive parts of the film. Some audiences hated him, calling the character unbearable. Others adored him, seeing him as the purest expression of the fifth element's commitment to excess. Over time, the haters quieted, but Ruby never did. He became a cult figure inside a cult movie, quoted, imitated, impossible to erase. And maybe that's the real secret. Prince might have been too perfect, too expected. With Tucker, Ruby Rhod became unstable, unpredictable, a force that feels like it could implode at any second. That instability is exactly what makes him unforgettable. In a movie about chaos dressed as destiny, Ruby Rhod is the chaos incarnate. But Ruby wasn't the only role balanced on a knife's edge. Corbin Dallas, the cab driver turned savior, almost had a very different face. The Corbin Dallas pivot. Corbin Dallas wasn't always Bruce Willis. In fact, for a while, the role looked like it would belong to another titan of the 1990s, Mel Gibson. At the time, Gibson had just come off the global success of Braveheart. He was bankable, rugged, and carried the kind of brooding gravitas studios loved. On paper, it seemed perfect. A battle-hardened warrior thrust into the chaos of the future. Gibson could have delivered that in his sleep. But Luc Besson hesitated. Gibson's energy was heavy, serious, and deeply grounded. And that was the problem. Besson didn't want Corbin Dallas to be another stone-faced action hero. He wanted humor under pressure. Someone who could look at a world collapsing in neon flames and still find a way to mutter a joke under his breath. Someone who could play exhaustion, irony, and disbelief without losing credibility. That meant the character needed more than grit. He needed warmth. Enter Bruce Willis. Willis had already built a career on balancing chaos with charm. In Die Hard, he redefined the action hero as a sarcastic everyman cop who bled, limped, and wisecracked his way through impossible odds. He wasn't larger than life like Schwarzenegger, and he wasn't Shakespearean like Gibson. He was blue-collar, relatable, the kind of guy you'd imagine sharing a cigarette with in a cab before the world fell apart. That was exactly the energy Besson needed. With Willis on board, Corbin Dallas transformed. Instead of a mythic warrior, he became an ex-soldier who felt like the last normal guy left in an insane galaxy. His dry wit didn't just get laughs. It acted as a stabilizer for the movie's chaos. Surrounded by fashion explosions, alien opera, and Chris Tucker's Ruby Rhod screeching at full volume, Willis held the center by doing less. He delivered his lines with understatement, playing exhaustion rather than exaggeration. In a world that shouted, he whispered, and that made him stand out even more. One of the film's most unexpected choices reinforced this restraint. Corbin Dallas and the villain, Jean-Baptiste Emmanuel Zorg, never share a scene. Not once. No face-to-face confrontation, no climactic duel, no witty banter between good and evil. In most blockbusters, that would be unthinkable. The hero and villain are supposed to collide, but Besson flipped the formula. Instead of direct conflict, the film builds tension through ripple effects. Corbin's actions disrupt Zorg's plans, and Zorg's greed sets obstacles in Corbin's path, but they remain orbiting each other like planets that never align. This structural decision makes the movie stranger, but also more interesting. By refusing the expected showdown, Besson keeps the story unpredictable. Audiences wait for the inevitable confrontation that never comes, which keeps the tension alive in a way few sci-fi films dared to attempt. It also underscores a deeper theme, that chaos, not personal rivalry, is the true villain of the story. Corbin isn't fighting Zorg so much as he's fighting the collapse of everything, and Zorg just happens to be another piece of that collapse. For Willis, this approach worked perfectly. It let him play the reluctant hero, someone who isn't even aware of the villain plotting against him. He doesn't need to rise into a gladiatorial showdown. He just has to keep moving forward, surviving, making quips, and trying to piece together why a half-naked woman dropped into his cab. His performance grounds the entire narrative. Without Willis, the fifth element might have collapsed under its own excess. With him, it found its anchor. Speaking of Leelu, her voice on screen wasn't always the only voice in play. One iconic performance hid a surprising pairing. Two divas, one voice. The diva Plavalaguna doesn't just enter the fifth element. She arrives like a revelation. Tall, wrapped in shimmering blue, with movements that feel equal parts regal and alien, she steals the film for nearly 10 minutes and leaves behind one of its most unforgettable sequences. But here's the trick. The diva you see and the diva you hear were never the same person. On screen, the role is performed by French actress and director Mai Wen. Her physical presence gives the diva her poise, her elegance, her strange, almost sacred aura. But when she opens her mouth, the sound that pours out belongs to someone else entirely. Albanian soprano, Inva Mula. It wasn't a production accident or a last-minute substitution. It was deliberate. Luc Besson wanted the diva to feel otherworldly, a being so elevated that no single performer could contain her. So he split the character in two: body and voice, appearance and sound. Inva Mula's recording wasn't just standard opera, either. The famous aria begins as a faithful rendition of Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor. But halfway through, it breaks apart into something no human voice could naturally perform. Notes leap impossibly fast. Runs twist and climb with inhuman precision. People in theaters in 1997 asked the same question. Who could possibly sing like that? The answer was no one. The effect was achieved through meticulous editing. Mula sang real coloratura passages, difficult acrobatic runs designed to show off a soprano's skill. Then sound engineers cut, spliced, and digitally manipulated those recordings, stretching them past the limits of human agility. The result wasn't artificial in the sense of being invented from scratch. It was rooted in reality, then pushed until it sounded supernatural. That blend mirrored the film itself, practical sets and costumes colliding with early digital effects. Analog craft twisted into futuristic fantasy. It worked better than anyone could have predicted. The aria became a set piece so iconic that it has been recreated on talent shows, in tribute concerts, even in video games. Yet the original remains untouchable. It isn't just a vocal stunt. It's a moment where cinema, music, and myth fuse into one. The diva doesn't just sing. She becomes a conduit, unlocking the stone of ultimate power, setting the stage for Leelu's transformation, and reminding audiences that spectacle can be both visual and auditory. But behind the curtain, the sequence carried a shadow. Mai Wen, the woman embodying the diva, was Luc Besson's wife during production. She had supported him through the years it took to bring the fifth element to life. Yet, while filming, Besson began growing closer to his lead actress, Milla Jovovich. Long days of rehearsing alien dialogue, late nights refining scripts, and the intense collaboration required for Leelu's role created a connection that quietly deepened into romance. By the time filming wrapped, Besson had separated from Mai Wen and was openly with Jovovich. That personal shift adds a strange undercurrent to the diva's performance. On screen, Mai Wen embodies transcendence, a figure who literally carries the key to humanity's salvation inside her. But off-screen, she was playing that role at the same moment her marriage was dissolving. The aria that defines the film's midpoint, a performance about beauty and loss, carries with it the invisible weight of heartbreak. It's one of those moments where cinema and life overlap in unsettling ways. The diva Plava Laguna isn't just a fictional alien diva. She's also the image of a woman whose personal world was changing, paired with the voice of another performer, all orchestrated by a director whose life was shifting just as drastically. That's why the sequence feels so layered, because it was. Leelu isn't just a visual icon in orange straps and white bandages. She speaks a language that didn't exist until it did. Leelu's living language. Leelu wasn't just a character. She was a puzzle, and her voice was one of its strangest pieces. Most science fiction characters speak English with an accent, or they mumble a few invented syllables before switching back to common tongue. But Luc Besson wanted more. If Leelu was to feel truly alien, she needed a language that nobody had heard before. So he did what he had been doing since his teenage years. He invented one. He called it the divine language. It wasn't a handful of random sounds or some gibberish stitched together for effect. Besson built it carefully, designing several hundred unique words with their own syntax and cadence. He mapped the rules of the language the way a linguist might, making sure sentences could be built consistently and words could evolve into phrases without sounding like repetition. This wasn't a party trick, it was a functioning tongue. Milla Jovovich, who had already thrown herself headfirst into the physical demands of Leelu's role, decided she wouldn't just memorize lines phonetically. She would learn the divine language until it felt fluent. She practiced endlessly with Besson, repeating words back and forth until they sounded natural, even playful. By the time the cameras rolled, Jovovich wasn't just reciting memorized nonsense. She was speaking. Reports from the set reveal how far this practice went. Jovovich and Besson began trading private notes in the divine language, writing to each other in a script no one else could read. What started as an exercise in building fluency became something more intimate, a personal code. Actors usually connect with directors through shared direction, tone, and feedback. Jovovich and Besson built an entire secret channel of communication. They were literally speaking a language no one else on set could understand. This decision gave Leelu's dialogue a rare authenticity. When she babbles excitedly at Corbin, it isn't random noise, it's a structured, consistent language. When she whispers softly to herself, the syntax flows like an alien stream of consciousness. Even when she screams, "Big bada boom," in broken English, you can hear the alien grammar underneath. The divine language turned Leelu into more than an orange-haired warrior. It made her feel like someone raised outside humanity, dropped into its chaos with only fragments of shared understanding. That sense of innocence, of language as discovery, shaped Jovovich's entire performance. Leelu doesn't speak with human rhythm. She pauses oddly, shifts tones mid-sentence, stumbles in ways that sound more childlike than robotic. Instead of acting alien, Jovovich was simply following the language's design. It gave her lines a texture that even subtitles couldn't capture. You didn't just hear her, you believed her. It's one of the reasons Leelu became an enduring sci-fi figure. She isn't just a visual icon in bandages and straps. She's linguistically alien in a way few characters are. Compare her to other alien languages in cinema: Klingon, Elvish, Na'vi. Those tongues were built by teams of linguists, but they were almost always used sparingly or for spectacle. The divine language, by contrast, was personal. It wasn't meant for global fandom, it was meant for two people on a film set, speaking to each other in secret. That intimacy bleeds into the performance. Fans later tried to catalog the words, creating dictionaries and glossaries. But what mattered most wasn't linguistic perfection. It was the illusion of life. Leelu's language wasn't just another sci-fi gimmick. It was a heartbeat, evidence that her world extended beyond the screen, that she thought and dreamed in a tongue that no human had taught her. And yet, For all its beauty, The Fifth Element wasn't just talk. For every alien syllable and poetic gesture, there was action, explosions, chaos, weapons that weren't just props. The gun that breathed fire. Gary Oldman's Zorg strutted onto the screen armed with one of the most ridiculous, over-the-top weapons ever imagined. The ZF-1. A rocket launcher, net gun, poison dart shooter, flamethrower, and remote detonator, all packed into a single shiny package. In the hands of a lesser film, it would have been pure cartoon. In The Fifth Element, it became unforgettable. And that's partly because at least one version of the ZF-1 wasn't just a prop, it was dangerously real. The production team designed multiple ZF-1 units, some lightweight for stunt work and others rigged for pyrotechnics. One of those rigs included a working flamethrower. During testing, the flames roared higher than expected, licking across the studio ceiling and startling everyone within range. Crew members scrambled with extinguishers, and after that, strict caution followed every time the weapon was brought out. It was the perfect metaphor for the fifth element, spectacle teetering on the edge of chaos. This wasn't an isolated case. Luc Besson leaned heavily on practical effects, preferring the tangible danger of real explosions and moving parts to the safer route of CGI. The most spectacular example was the Opera House blast. That sequence, where the diva's performance collides with chaos and gunfire, required one of the largest indoor explosions ever staged at the time. Pinewood Studios' legendary 007 stage was rigged with walls ready to collapse, fire charges placed with surgical precision, and cameras positioned everywhere to capture the destruction. There was no second chance. If something failed, the set would be gone, and the scene lost. Fire marshals stood by, the crew braced for impact, and then detonation. The blast ripped through the stage, glass shattering, debris raining down, flames curling into the rafters. It was violent, messy, and real. What audiences saw wasn't a computer simulation. It was raw demolition, orchestrated like a symphony of chaos, captured in a single shot. This commitment to physicality extended to the film's vision of the future city. Those dizzying vertical skylines weren't conjured in a server farm, they were built by hand. Dozens of miniature skyscrapers, each layered with detail, wires, and paint, created a city that could actually be touched. Motion control cameras swept through the models, capturing them in ways that gave depth and texture no early CGI could replicate. Only after the practical footage was secured did digital artists add flying cars and neon signs, layering movement on top of a physical skeleton. The result was a hybrid future, half handmade, half digital. It looked more convincing precisely because it had weight. Buildings caught light like real surfaces, because they were. Cars darted through air that felt thick with smog, because the miniatures gave it dimension. At a time when most science fiction films were pushing into computer-generated territory, The Fifth Element embraced a philosophy that mixed the old with the new. Build it first, then enhance. That philosophy gave the film its gritty surrealism. The weapons had edges, the explosions had heat, and the city felt lived in rather than painted. Even the ZF-1 itself carried that duality, cartoon in concept, terrifying in execution. Watching Oldman demonstrate its features with slick menace, audiences laughed at the absurdity while subconsciously registering the danger. Because somewhere in the back of their minds, they could sense it wasn't entirely fake. Practicality ended at the costume's edge. Fashion powered the film's world, but comfort wasn't part of the brief. Fashion that fought back. In The Fifth Element, the future didn't just arrive. It walked in, dressed by Jean-Paul Gaultier. The French couturier, already a fashion icon, wasn't content to design a handful of standout costumes. He built an entire galaxy's wardrobe. Over 1,000 bespoke looks were created for the film. Stitched and tailored for everyone from main characters to background extras, glimpsed for only seconds. No one wore generic futuristic jumpsuits. Every alien race, every social class, every passerby was clothed in something original. Uniforms weren't just uniforms, they were sociology. You could tell who someone was, where they came from, and what they valued simply by looking at their seams. The Mondoshawans were armored priests, wrapped in layers that made them look ancient, immovable, almost geological. The Mangalores were chaos incarnate, metal plates, rough textures, snarling masks that looked more like battlefield scrap than clothing. Even cab drivers wore reflective gear that hinted at grime, danger, and urban survival. In The Fifth Element, the script didn't need to explain society's divisions. The costumes already did. But this level of detail came at a brutal cost. The Mondoshawan suits, seen in the film's opening sequence, looked majestic on screen. In reality, they weighed nearly 80 pounds each, with almost no ventilation. Performers inside could barely move, shuffling slowly through ancient corridors, not because of dramatic choice, but because their bodies were on the edge of collapse. At least one actor fainted from overheating during the shoot. The statuesque elegance audiences admired was, in truth, survival at 1 step per second. The suffering wasn't limited to the giant aliens. Extras and supporting actors endured elaborate designs that looked stunning but restricted their ability to walk, bend, or even sit. Ruby Rhod's costumes for Chris Tucker were practically torture devices, forcing him to stand between takes like a mannequin, because sitting was impossible. The film's couture wasn't designed for comfort, it was designed for spectacle. And spectacle demands sacrifice. Still, the payoff was undeniable. Gaultier's costumes gave the film an identity no other science fiction project had attempted, where most movies leaned on recycled space armor or sterile uniform aesthetics. The Fifth Element exploded into color, texture, and silhouette. It wasn't the cold, militarized future of Alien or Blade Runner's shadow-soaked dystopia. It was loud, flamboyant, and brazenly impractical, because in Besson's world, the future wasn't gray. It was dressed to slay. Besson doubled down on that vision by rejecting the genre's darkest visual traditions. Instead of hiding flaws in shadow, he shot key action scenes in full daylight, or sterile whites. Flying taxis chased under bright blue skies. Explosions rippled across golden clouds. Battles unfolded in environments where every stitch of Gaultier's designs was fully visible. It was a gamble, because bright light exposes everything: fabric seams, rivets, matte lines, imperfections in practical and digital effects. But Besson wanted the audience to see it all: the boldness of the costumes, the audacity of the sets, the very seams of the universe. He put them in the spotlight. That decision turned the film into a living fashion show, a sci-fi opera staged not in darkness but in radiant color. Gaultier's fingerprints were everywhere. A security guard looked like a nightclub bouncer from another dimension. A flight attendant wore a skin-tight corset with exaggerated shoulders. Even a background pedestrian, glimpsed for only 2 seconds, sported a custom-made ensemble that hinted at their place in this society. The detail was obsessive, but it paid off. The future felt less like a sterile fantasy and more like a living, breathing city, buzzing with texture and personality. If these strange truths changed how you see The Fifth Element, like, comment, and subscribe. Tell us which legendary production we should dissect next, and tap the next video on screen for more wild, true stories from cinema's most daring worlds.